Do you think the Ukraine-Russia war is at its root a geopolitical conflict? If your answer is yes, let me prove you wrong. Hello everybody, Dr. Edwin Mitsevsky here, retired brigadier general and political philosopher who has been dealing with issues of international relations, national security, and military affairs from a humanities and philosophical standpoint in the academic part of my career. If it interests you to tackle the essence and deepest layers of conflict and war, rather than merely looking at what happens on the surface, please join me and subscribe to my channel. And stay till the end of this video, as there are some surprises awaiting you at the conclusion. The Ukraine war, from a purely strategic standpoint, was easily avoidable, and in principle, it could still be easily resolved today. I have presented these arguments in detail through a comprehensive analysis I refer to as the Ukraine trilogy. However, the reason why the war in Ukraine hasn't been ended is that, in essence, it is not a geopolitical conflict. At its core, it is an ideological one. And ideologies, as history has repeatedly demonstrated, are immune to strategic logic. In the case of Ukraine, after years of strategic misjudgment, the political elites remain unmoved, even inert to the fundamental analyses I provided in my Ukraine trilogy and in a strategic memorandum based on it that I sent to American and European political stakeholders. Today, we will uncover the origins of this ideology that underpins that conflict, which has had a significant impact not only on the Ukraine, but on international relations since the end of the Cold War. We will look at the Neoconservative Movement and their doctrine in the United States, which has shaped Western foreign policy and contaminated a host of European politicians' minds with their doctrine, including the Ukraine president. We are going to trace that ideology to its root, to a German Jewish philosopher who emigrated to Chicago, whose ideas were brilliant, subtle, but deliberately misread by the very people who claimed to be his disciples. Leo Strauss, who lived from 1899 to 1973. While Strauss died long before Zelensky took office, he's frequently cited by critics, and rightly so, as the intellectual godfather of the neoconservative movement in the United States that shaped Euro-Atlantic foreign affairs since the end of the Cold War, including America's deep involvement in Ukraine. And we are going to trace how neoconservatism found its perfect instrument in Kyiv to extend its influence into Central and Eastern Europe. The central claim of neoconservatism is seductive in its simplicity. Liberal democracy is not merely one political arrangement among others. It is, according to the neoconservative doctrine, the universal destiny of mankind. So from the get-go, it is evident that this is not a geopolitical concept. It is an eschatological premise. It borrows from Hegel the idea that history has a direction, a telos, and at the end point is the liberal democratic state. Francis Fukuyama made this explicit right after the Cold War in The End of History and the Last Man. He argued that liberal democracy and market capitalism represented the final stage of ideological evolution. The collapse of the Soviet Union seemed to confirm his thesis. And yet Fukuyama's theory goes beyond the simple assertion of liberal democracy's universality. He integrates the concept of recognition, rooted in Hegel's dialectic and Plato's notion of the thymos, the aspect of the soul that strives for honor and dignity. According to Fukuyama, the human impulse for recognition is a fundamental force in both individual and collective social and political behavior. The Thymotic drive is not fulfilled by material prosperity alone. Instead, it reflects a deeper need for acknowledgement as moral beings possessing intrinsic worth and self-awareness. Crucially, Fukuyama argues that this thymotic urge persists even after the supposed triumph of the liberal order. It persists beyond material satisfaction and continues even after liberalism's triumph. And, my addition, especially among cultures outside the Western tradition that do not share the Western liberal paradigm or even consider it a degenerate and corrupt threat. For these groups, among which we have to count Russia, feelings of marginalization within the global system endure, sustaining their desire for recognition and ensuring that the quest for dignity is never fully extinguished. And here is where the doctrine becomes dangerous and the catastrophe of post-Cold War affairs in international relations and national security sets in. An ideational concept of historical philosophy, expounding the spiritual essence of political evolution, was taken as a literal encouragement for power politics and unilateral enforcement of global expansion. This is the theoretical foundation upon which the entire edifice of liberal interventionism was constructed, from Iraq to Libya, from Syria to Ukraine. It is the essential reason why the post-Cold War project failed and set the Middle East and eventually Europe on fire. To understand what happened, we need to become aware of a crucial distinction, a concept that the philosopher Hannah Arendt has addressed in the first place, namely the distinction between a private, even doctrinal conviction, e.g. Islam or Christianity is the absolute truth or any other such worldview, harmless in itself, even if it's absolutist, and the totalitarian turn, the decision to implement this truth as the sole organizing principle of society, erasing pluralism, debate, and particular identities of necessary, if necessary, by law, pressure, indoctrination, and force. Regarding Islam, the French philosopher Alain Finkielkraut used the term integralism for when a belief system demands the social and political imposition of a religious type of order, Sharia norms, gender segregation. But the deeper logic he draws from Arendt applies far beyond religion. Not the totalitarian faith, be it Islam, LGBTQ, climate change, hurts, but the political project to implement it by all and any means. It is the same move we see when any ideology, religious or secular, crosses from belief into coercive universalism. Now, what we see happening in religion, social affairs, and political ideology, we also see happening in international relations, where this totalitarian leap produced the most widespread and pernicious result for entire nations and regions of the world. The in and of itself harmless belief in liberal democracy, with its emphasis on individual rights, free markets, secular governance, became, after 1989, an integralist totalitarian project. History had supposedly ended. Liberal democracy had won. All that remained was expansion. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States and its European partners moved from containment to active export of the liberal democratic model. The Wolfowitz doctrine, the end of history euphoria, the Arab Spring interventions, Iraq 2003. They ignored warnings that universalist projects breed disintegration when they dismiss the weight of history, national identity, borders, and the human need for recognition. The conviction that liberal democracy is the only legitimate end state for all humanity, and that history's job is to impose it everywhere by sanctions, regime change, NATO expansion, color revolutions, or military force, if necessary, became the operating doctrine of the neoconservative movement. Messianic liberalism found its executors in the Neoconservative Movement in the US, willfully supported by vassal-like politicians in the European Union. Altogether, a bunch of people influential in foreign affairs far beyond Republican and conservative political quarters, who were convinced it was their right and duty to remake the world according to their belief system. The Cold War was over, liberal democracy had won. What remained was simply expansion. And if liberal democracy is universal destiny, then any state that resists it is not exercising legitimate authority and sovereignty. It is obstructing the march of history. And obstacles in this world view are not negotiated with, they are removed. If this framework is useful to you, if you believe these questions deserve a place in our public discourse, please consider subscribing to my channel. It signals to the algorithm that consistent, rigorous analysis matters. Now, let us turn to the decisive and often misunderstood influence of Leo Strauss on neoconservative thinking itself. Strauss was preoccupied with the relationship between philosophy and the city, between truth and political life. He argued that the great philosophers wrote esoterically, hiding their most radical ideas because the political community cannot bear unmediated truth. Societies need myth. They need moral horizons. Without them, they dissolve. So he introduced the noble lie, which is not a malicious falsehood nor a cynical deception, but the moral foundation that hold a political order together, prevented from falling into chaos and nihilism. The Straussian would argue that telling the raw, unvarnished truth, for instance, that a collapse of a nation might be imminent, would be irresponsible. Instead, the leader provides a truth that serves the survival of the state, the myth of invincibility and inevitable victory. As we will find out, this is exactly what manifested in Ukraine as well. Strauss himself was a profound political realist, though of a more subtle kind than the structural realists of international relations theory. Strauss was not a universalist, but a skeptic of modernity. He did not believe that any single political form was the destiny of all peoples. He was deeply wary of the Enlightenment's faith that reason alone could ground political order. And he saw the nihilism Nietzsche had diagnosed before him lurking beneath the surface of liberal civilization. And what the neoconservatives did with Strauss is one of the great intellectual distortions of the 20th century. Figures like Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, Irving Kristol, William Kristol, Robert Kagan, and Victoria Nuland, all names we identify with hardcore neoconservatism in the United States, are not the heirs of Strauss. They are his distorters. They took his critique of modernity, his insistence that Western civilization required a vital, confident sense of its own worth, and turned it into a missionary doctrine. They extracted the noble lie from its philosophical context and weaponized it as justification for elite management of public opinion in service of a global democratic crusade. Now, you don't have to take my word alone for it. In 1997, the Project for the New American Century openly called for global American leadership, what it termed benevolent global hegemony. It comprised military dominance sufficient to deter any rival. It comprised the instrument of military intervention as a legitimate means of enforcing worldwide dominance. And it comprised a foreign policy that promoted, in its own words, political and economic freedom abroad. All of it together a license for regime change. Victoria Nuland became the institutional embodiment of this doctrine. As Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs under Obama, Nuland was the primary American architect of US policy toward Ukraine during the 2014 Maidan crisis. Her intercepted call with the American ambassador about post-Maidan governmental arrangements in Ukraine, in which she made her infamous remark, "Fuck the EU," revealed the extent of American involvement in the Maidan coup in Ukraine. Her husband, Robert Kagan, co-founder of the Project for the New American Century, had already argued in his book Of Paradise and Power in 2003 that Europe had retreated into a what he called Kantian paradise of eternal peace, while America bore the Hobbesian burden of enforcing and maintaining global order. Together, this couple represents the personified fusion of neoconservative ideology and institutional power. The Maidan was neither purely spontaneous nor purely manufactured. It was the collision of genuine Ukrainian grievances with a pre-existing American strategic neoconservative objective: to lock Ukraine into Western institutions, NATO and the European Union, right on Russia's border. An objective that had been explicit since the 2008 Bucharest summit. At the time, realist giants of international relations, George Kennan, Henry Kissinger, John Mersheimer, and so did I, called it a tragic mistake at the time, and constructed the argument for why it produced exactly the mayhem that we are witnessing right now. Yet the neoconservative doctrine has no room for such caution. Strategic caution smells of appeasement, of Munich, of Chamberlain. And so the march continued. Even when a negotiated settlement was on the table in Istanbul in March and April of 2022, neutrality in exchange for security guarantees, the ideological commitment to Ukraine's eventual NATO membership made compromise impossible. Strategic restraint was available. It was rejected not on strategic grounds, but on ideological ones. Enter Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, I want to be analytically precise here. This is not a condemnation of Zelensky's courage or his genuine commitment to Ukraine. It is a classical tragedy in the Aristotelian sense. The tragic figure is not a villain. The tragic figure is someone whose qualities, their very strength, become the instrument of catastrophe. The fatal flaw, as Aristotle expounded in his Poetics, is inseparable from what makes the figure great. Zelensky, the gifted television performer, stepped into the role the neoconservative narrative had written for him. Liberal democracy versus alleged authoritarian darkness. A clean, morally unimpeachable cause that transformed a territorial and sovereignty dispute into a civilizational struggle. It is only strong if it has a clear, irreconcilable enemy. So an enemy whose alleged genuine authoritarian character made the moral contrast clean and legible. And here the tragedy deepens. Because civilizational struggles, unlike territorial disputes, do not end in negotiated settlements. You do not negotiate the termination of a civilizational conflict. You do not compromise with the enemies of liberal, democratic destiny. This is precisely why, as I have argued in my analysis of the Oval Office rupture, Zelensky cannot conclude a peace that his Western audience would recognize as illegitimate. He has framed this war in terms that make any compromise a betrayal. He did not create this framing alone, however. He inherited it from the neoconservative edifice. He amplified it through his performative gifts. And now he is its prisoner. After the Russian invasion in 2022, Zelensky resorted to the Straussian myth of the united people. His rhetoric shifted to a deeply Straussian national mythology thinking. There's only one Ukraine, it is ancient, and it is the shield of Western civilization. Leo Strauss believed that modern liberal societies are prone to softness and internal division. He argued that a strong society requires a clear distinction between friend and enemy, which he had taken from Carl Schmitt. This meant for Zelensky to create a moral clarity that didn't exist in 2014. By framing the war as a battle between civilization, Ukraine, and barbarism, Russia, he used a classic Straussian technique to replace internal political bickering with a singular existential purpose. So the hatred for Russia, a clear friend-enemy distinction, and a one-sided attribution of guilt, expressed many times over by Zelensky in speeches, interviews, podcasts, was added as a political construct to the ideological strife in its extreme and made a neutral diplomatic path impossible. But also, the more controversial Straussian idea of the secret elite, the information vertical, was adopted. A small group of wise individuals must guide the masses. When Zelensky consolidated all major TV stations into a single state-directed broadcast, critics called it censorship, but from a Straussian perspective, it is nothing but managing Plato's cave. In a time of crisis, the wartime leader has to be the philosopher king who controls the images and narratives the public sees to ensure that they don't lose the will to fight. And yet even another Straussian perspective must be thrown into the equation to get a clear picture of the ideational concept that underpins the entire armed conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Sacrificing the physical for the metaphysical as one of the most common critiques of Straussian influence came to fruition. The survival of the idea, democracy-Western alignment, was given priority over the survival of the people, the physical destruction of the country. This is why the ruin of Ukraine was not a mistake, but a conscious philosophical choice. That it is better for the country to be destroyed, but remain pure and Western aligned, rather than to exist as a compromised or neutral and dependent state. The phantasm that Zelensky absorbed, the utopian idea of Ukraine as the eastern frontier of a liberal democratic order, has become the iron logic of his political survival. If that frontier retreats, if Ukraine would accept territorial accommodations, if NATO membership would be deferred, if neutrality would be accepted as the price of peace, then the sacrifice of a generation of young Ukrainians would be rendered purposeless. That is a political and psychological impossibility for any leader who has staked his entire identity on the cause. And so the war continues, not because the strategic logic demands it, not because the military situation makes it viable, but because the ideological framework within which Zelensky and his clan operate has made stopping impossible. In my Ukraine trilogy, I argued that strategic restraint, the policy of negotiated Ukrainian neutrality, territorial accommodation, and structured engagement with Russia's legitimate security concerns, was not only the recipe for peace, but the recipe that could have prevented this war entirely. The question that haunts this entire analysis is, why was strategic restraint not merely rejected after 2022, but rejected at every preceding inflection point? At Bucharest in 2008, during the Maidan in 2014, at Minsk in 2015, at Istanbul in 2022. The answer is not geopolitical. The answer is ideological. A doctrine that frames liberal democratic expansion as historical destiny cannot accept the legitimacy of a boundary to that expansion. To accept a boundary is to concede that the telos was false, that history has no direction, that the entire ideological edifice collapses. The neoconservatives provided the ideological layer. Brzezinski's grand chessboard, as I explained in an extra video, provided the strategic map. And Zelensky, the tragic actor, provided the face. The result? A generation of Ukrainian young men in the ground. What this analysis means is the Ukraine war is a tragedy in the classical sense, a conflict in which multiple parties, each acting from within their own logic, produced a catastrophe that none of them could, within that logic, have avoided. The neoconservatives could not stop their expansion. Their ideology demanded it. Zelensky could not refuse the role he was offered. His political survival required it. Putin could not accept the strategic outcome. His threat perception demanded a response. And the young men of Ukraine could not refuse, because that is what young men do, at least most of them, when their country calls them. Strategic restraint before the outbreak of the war, and specifically now in its 5th year, failed not because it was strategically wrong. It was right, and it still is. It failed because the ideological framework prosecuting this war had no philosophical room for it. Until that ideology is confronted, named, analyzed, and rejected in favor of idealistic realism, as I called it, that recognizes the genuine interest and legitimate agency of all parties involved, no peace framework is sustainable. And the tragedy will continue to compound. Thank you for watching. Please spread the message, join the debate, and subscribe. Take care, and God bless.